go ahead and get started here. This is Law in Cyberspace panel. I want to get it going so all of our presenters have plenty of time to give their presentation. This is going to be a little bit different than the last panel. For those of you who are in this room, we're going to have each presenter come up and give a presentation, about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions for them interspersed, so you can ask right after their presentation if you like. You don't have to wait till the end. So, come on in. My name is Rob Barnsby. I am the Cyber Law Fellow for the Army Cyber Institute, and very pleased to be here with all of you. I'm pleased to be in that particular position at West Point. We have a great panel here because although each person's paper can relate to law, and does so in a very good way in terms of international law and their understanding of it, none of them are actual lawyers. It's a non-lawyer panel. And I'll tell you, they understand the law probably better than most lawyers I know, that's for sure. Their papers are in your materials. So we understand that you may not have read them, but you will have them in your materials. And also their full biography will be in your materials. So I'll just quickly introduce them and allow them to speak. We have a geographically diverse panel. Very pleased to have that with several countries represented, France, Estonia, in Italy. We also have from West Point, Nerea Cal is going to go first in a minute. And as one who went to school there, I can tell you sometimes that feels farther away than all the other places. But and certainly our friends here, cadets who Nerea brought, are happy to talk to you at any time. This is what this is all about. If you ever want to talk to cadets, I guarantee they're very happy to be here. And all you, I think it's fair to say, would be very pleased if you in any way point them in the direction of free food. They would be your friends for life. I can promise you that. But we'll get started. We're going to start here with Nerea Cal. She is a captain in the Army. She teaches in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point, IR, International Relations, obviously her specialty. And she, in a very bold move for a U.S. Army officer, is going with no slides. Very bold. But she is going to talk to us about her excellent paper, Crossing the Rubicon, Identifying and Responding to an Armed Cyber Attack. Nerea.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks to ACI for having me. So if you ever find yourself in a position as your first real conference presentation in a subject that you're not an expert on, you should bring people to pad the audience with so they can throw you some softballs, guys. And yeah, I first of all thought what a countercultural move it might be. You know, we're in a community we're supposed to think outside the box, to not have slides as an Army officer. And then after I saw the Raytheon slides, I thought, well, I mean, who's going to be those? So I'm glad I didn't even try. So I'm going to talk about how to apply the law of armed conflict to cyber, and specifically how to identify the threshold at which a cyber attack can be deemed an armed attack, and then how we should respond. So I'd like to sort of set the stage for you and have you imagine the following scenario, in which a group of international attackers international hackers attack the United States in phases. And in the first phase, they cripple the country's banking system, blocking the access of millions of Americans to their checking accounts. Next, they'll infiltrate the Department of Defense systems, preventing communication among military leaders, and disabling critical defense infrastructure. Finally, the attackers succeed in shutting down Washington, D.C.'s electrical grid. The streets are jammed with traffic, airports are forced to halt operations, and hospitals are forced to switch to generators with a limited capacity to provide power to essential life-saving equipment. So the real puzzle here that I'm trying to address is, should the United States consider this, or something like this, an act of war? What constitutes an armed attack, in cyberspace, and how should the United States, once it is attributed responsibility, respond to something like this? And this scenario is not completely unrealistic, as we've heard from several of the speakers today. This is really the concern moving into the future. As our connectivity and dependence on digital networks increases, the cost of perpetrating these kinds of attacks decreases. A group with modest financial means and better than average technical skills could inflict significant damage on critical infrastructure. Academics, military leaders, and policymakers have taken steps to try to understand and counter nefarious cyber activity. We've CCD COE as a partner in this conference has been one of the leaders in this realm. In 2010, the United States formed CyberCom to try to generate, employ, and integrate our cyber capabilities. We've got the President's international strategy for cyberspace. A lot of discussion around this topic, but as I see it, no clear framework yet for when and how to respond. So my paper aimed to address the following questions. I outline a set of international laws that govern war very briefly, highlight the challenges in applying them to cyber warfare, and I try to provide recommendations for how to apply those laws to cyberspace, specifically advocating for an effects-based definition of an armed attack that provides a legal avenue for the United States to respond to cyber attacks perpetrated by non-state actors. So first of all, the set of laws that we generally turn to inform our response or inform how we should act in terms of warfare. The UN Charter is really the main source for jus ad bellum, the decision to use force. So Article 2.4 states that we should refrain from the threat of force against territorial integrity or political independence. And so essentially this concept of sovereignty. But Article 51 gives states an inherent right of individual or collective self-defense in the face of an armed attack. So the real problem is, well, what is that? And cyberspace convolutes this concept of traditional sovereignty. It obscures the perpetrators of the attack, and it complicates the ability to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in a way that makes identifying an armed attack quite challenging. So really we need to reinterpret international law for cyberspace. The Talon Manual, which CCD-COE helped develop, is really the best attempt so far. But it amounts to a definitional challenge. And there are three main approaches for how to define an armed attack. And they're based on an effort to treat the cyber domain as close as possible to the physical domain, to draw an analogy between the two. The first approach is an instrument-based approach, which emphasizes the tools used to perpetrate an attack, and essentially restrains that definition to traditional weapons with physical characteristics. So it's a narrow definition that excludes cyber attacks as being able to be considered armed attacks. I contend it's too narrow of a definition. The second approach is target-based and evaluates the attack based on the system that it targets. And so that scenario that I laid out at the beginning of this presentation, according to this approach, every phase of that scenario could be considered an armed attack. It also potentially includes cyber espionage, which contradicts the ICC's ruling to consider scale and effects in the evaluation of an attack. And it increases the risks of escalation into a conventional attack. The third approach, which is the approach that I think is probably the best one to use, is an effects-based approach. And it considers an armed attack, a cyber attack, an armed attack, if the effect is equivalent to that of an armed attack carried out by physical means. So in our hypothetical scenario, if that loss of power were to result in deaths, because patients at the hospital would lose the power of the systems that are essentially providing them care, then that could be considered an armed attack. And this approach, this definition, incorporates the parallels to the physical domain while also recognizing the unique capabilities of certain tools in cyberspace. So essentially my recommendation is to combine a couple definitions. The Joint Chiefs of Staff has an effects-based definition, but they haven't quite clarified when certain attacks can be considered an armed attack. It's a very sort of broad definition. Specifically, when an armed attack can be considered a motivation for the use of the claim of self-defense. The Talon Manual is quite informative in this respect, and so I think the combination of this broad definition by the Joint Chiefs of Staff with the inclusion of the parameters that an attack should include a transborder element, and that you can consider composite armed attacks as part of a greater, you can aggregate them, these smaller attacks, and consider them part of a broader sort of operation. So that's my recommendation for how to identify or define the threshold at which an attack can be considered an armed attack. But the next problem then is another issue we've been hearing a lot about in today's presentations and panels, is this issue of attribution. So once you've identified that an attack is considered an armed attack, you have to identify who perpetrated it. And you know, the technical challenges aside, which are not what I've addressed in this paper, once you have attributed that attack, you then also confront the challenge of whether or not it's a state actor or a non-state actor. Now, if it's an attack linked to a state, it's a little more straightforward as to what sort of actions are possible or what the attack state, what sort of tools it has with which to respond, according to international law. Also, international law addresses this idea of organs of the state. So if it's an agency of the state or someone explicitly linked to the state, and you can make the argument that they are facilitated by the state, that also is rather straightforward in that you can treat that entity as if it is a state actor. Where it becomes a little harder is, what if it's a non-state actor that's not linked to the state? And you can have individuals who can perpetrate these types of attacks, and international law is not particularly clear about how to deal with these sorts of actors. The only real precedent for being able to act against non-state actors is, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and their attack on the United States in 9/11. So they're technically not subject to international law. My recommendation in this respect is to adopt a two-tiered approach. So if an attack, which crosses the threshold of an armed attack in cyberspace, is attributed to a non-state actor, my recommendation is to first allow the state from which the attack was generated to adjudicate that actor in accordance with their domestic legal system. However, if that state is unwilling or unable to do so, then I contend the United States or whatever state was attacked has the legal right to respond. Now, there are some potential critiques of my recommendations. Obviously, countries like China and Russia will criticize the United States for overstepping its bounds by unilaterally developing this sort of criteria and trying to shape international law. I'm slightly biased in this respect, but I think the United States has an opportunity and in some sense a duty to try to shape norms in international law in this space. And I think ultimately it can lead to international cooperation towards the development of a cybersecurity strategy. As we've heard, the US and China have shown at least some potential of cooperation in this realm. And so I think there's hope in this space to be able to, if the United States takes the lead in trying to shape these norms, for a broader international consensus. It also is beneficial to set these expectations and increase predictability. So if the United States can make clear what it expects and how it will respond, it may signal to our adversaries, what they should and shouldn't do, essentially. And it also contributes to deterrence by demonstrating our resolve and our capabilities. All of that said, I also recognize that policymakers and decision makers appreciate having some flexibility in definitions. So I don't necessarily believe that this will be these sorts of parameters are going to be communicated by policymakers and decision makers in very clearly defined ways. But I think that some more clarity in this space can be useful to both signaling to our adversaries and also providing a framework for those who are responsible for implementing and using offensive cyber capabilities. Thanks.
We'll open up for questions. Any of you have for Nerea on this topic while she's here? Please.
Hi.
Hi.
Bill with the Prayer for Future Lab. I'm a retired architect with some operational work. If I agree with looking at it as an effects space that's starting to permeate through the community now as to how cyber effects are looked at. Similar to traditional. But with the idea of what to do about a remedy for any violation of international law or utilizing a cyber offense to cause physical damage or destruction, do you see the mechanisms in place like international law to deal with war crimes, disputes between countries for armed attacks, violations of law, being adaptable to cyber physical activities, like an International Court of Justice claim for the Russians turning off the power grid in Ukraine?
I guess my question would be, why wouldn't we just use a system that's in place now? Does the method of attack really matter, or can we adjudicate those war crimes in the process, through the processes we already have available to us? I don't know why we would need a special system if it's an effects-based.
I don't think it needs to be a special system, but if we're grappling with how we use cyber stuff is so special that the president needs to approve even a small thing. That the president needs to, that the approval levels remain so high, but the effect may be so small in the battlefield or within a short space. So you would agree that the International Court of Justice for a war crime, the disputes between states would be sufficient to take disputes as to the use of cyber force and be able to successfully prosecute that if you can deal with the attribution and proof elements?
Yes, in terms of a court or a legal system by which to adjudicate these sorts of effects, I think the ICJ is really the best option we have, and it already faces so many challenges that the idea of creating a separate avenue or a separate realm in which to adjudicate cyber-specific actions. The ICJ has its own set of particular challenges, and a separate sort of cyber court would face the same kind. So I think we should just try to use a system we already have. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Bill Snyder from Syracuse University. I agree. It seems like the effects-based approach is becoming dominant, but would ask to apply two different hypothetical situations to using that. One is if that is it's the equivalent to the harm that an armed attack would in the physical space would cause. Imagine, and we'll pick on the Soviets since they aren't around to defend themselves, that a Soviet nuclear missile dropped into Rock Creek Park at the height of the Cold War and didn't go off. So the effects are zero. and President Nixon says, well, no harm, we can't use military force in response, it would be illegal. And it seems like that would be, in the physical space, an area where the effects base, looking at the outcome, wouldn't determine whether you could use armed force in response. And the second hypothetical is, what about if, for example, the Chinese were to infiltrate the supply chain and the networks and plant malware that would enable them to shut things down in a time of crisis, but don't turn it on? So has there been an armed attack? Not until they activated, and again, we couldn't use military response until it's activated. We would just have to take cleanup measures in the meantime. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting when you put it that way, that there's this potential for an effect, but it hasn't yet manifested. And that's where I think policymakers and decision makers really need that flexibility to take a definition but have some wiggle room in it to be able to deal with these more ambiguous scenarios. I mean, it really just, I think, depends on the context and the timing, the relationship between those two states at the time, the avenues of communication to be able to address, for example, in your first scenario, the fact that a bomb didn't go off. Is there a way to address, are there open lines of communication to be able to address what the potential effect would have been and how to react? And these are the challenges of international relations, that we can try to set parameters and constraints and definitions, but so much depends on context and trying to understand the second and third order effects of reacting. That I recognize that my recommendation, academically is satisfying, but in terms of implementing it in a real scenario is not necessarily that straightforward, and that's why we trust our leaders to be able to deal with these complex problems.
Thanks very much. I'm Mike Schmidt from the Naval War College. I have a question about your effects-based test. Everyone pretty much accepts the effects-based test today. The other tests are out of vogue. Moreover, everyone accepts the scale and effects standards set forth by Nicaragua. But the $1,000 question is, what's the threshold? So I wonder if you could articulate a threshold at which the right of self-defense under Article 51 would kick in. And the reason I ask this is because when Article 51 was being written, the issue came up of whether or not economic harm counts. And the delegates at San Francisco very clearly said economic harm would not count for Article 51. So my question is then, what is your threshold, and would it encompass severe economic harm to the state?
One second, I'm going to go ahead and pause you right there. In order to keep everyone on track, if you all could take this question into the hallway, if we're going to continue or afterwards. Sir, if we can go ahead and shift to the next one, in order to keep everyone on track.
Well, first I was going to First I was going to say, I know exactly who you are because you're like all of my resources in this paper. And I'm actually really looking forward to getting to meet you. You may not like this answer, but I think it depends. This is the challenge of, leadership, international relations, statecraft. When does this happen? What happened before? What are the potential consequences of retaliating, and how? What sort of tools do leaders have to respond to something like this? I would say, it certainly can be, but to be able to draw a line in the sand and say, this much economic damage, a dollar amount, or even, this much loss of life. I mean, there are lots of ethical questions to be explored there as well. And certainly the potential for a lot of really interesting research and academic work to come out of it. But if I were the president and I had to make the decision, where's the threshold, there are a lot of other factors that you have to consider to make that decision. And I don't think I am qualified to answer that, to be honest with you.
we'll definitely continue that discussion. Thanks, Mike, for being here. We will move on just to make sure everyone gets full opportunity to speak, and I think we will have time, but it's very important to have the questions along with the presentations too as we go here. Ana Chiara Rotondo is our next speaker. She was a postdoctoral fellow in IR at the University of Naples, and as I mentioned a bit earlier, comes from Italy to speak with us today and talk about her paper. She brought her husband Valerio here today, and very pleased to have him. He is a tax lawyer in Italy, and as I always say, you can never have too many lawyers in the room. So just a pleasure to have him. Ana Chiara will talk about countering cyber threats, answers from international law, building on the foundation that Nerea has set. Ana.
So a few seconds. First of all, I want to wish the CyCon committee for selecting my paper and inviting me here in DC. And I wish also to thank Robert for assisting all the panelists so far in moderating our session. The present event gives me, for the first time since when I've started to study the issue of cyber threats, the big opportunity of replacing the typical theoretical approach of international researchers. And facing legal problems related to cyberspace and certain specific uses of ICT with an operational approach, an operational legal approach. Well, cyber activities, particularly those of cross-border nature, have not yet been disciplined by international law. Despite the fact that cyberspace has become a strategic domain for all states. In fact, there is no evidence of customary law applicable to ICT activities, and the 2001 Budapest Convention on Cybercrime is the only multilateral treaty which deals with the issue. But this framework convention is aimed at establishing and consolidating judicial cooperation between the contracting parties only in cases of cybercrimes against individuals and not against states. Thus, the current international legal framework is clearly inadequate with respect to cyber threats towards states, especially if we consider the persistence of the principle of international law stated in Lotus case, according to which what is not prohibited by law is lawful, because the rule is the presumed freedom of states. That is to say, as long as ICT activities are not prohibited in international law, such activities are deemed to be lawful. This situation may put at risk the efficacy of national defense strategies, inasmuch as a state, in the person of any decision maker, is assailed by the so-called response crisis. That is the dilemma arising from the doubt that in case of a cyber threat or a cyber attack, any operative choice may lead to a violation of international law. So today, starting from this scenario of lacuna legis, I will try to assess the compatibility of the reactions carried out by states under the threat of a cyber attack or targeted by an attack with the contemporary international law, endorsing the lawfulness of active defense strategies, dealing with some problems related to the application of international law of state responsibility, and finally, suggesting an operative tool to guide the decision maker toward the right choice. Concerning the reactions of states under the threat of a cyber attack or targeted by an attack, in the silence of international law, active defense strategies seem to be a sustainable legal functional solution for the targeted state which doesn't want to remain defenseless. This because active defense strategies or measures do not constitute wrongful act if they never reach the threshold of countermeasures, consisting in cyber counterattacks, including those of a preventive nature, limited to surgically striking the systems from which the attack has been launched only in order to avoid damage to the national infrastructure. Therefore, active defense measures should be counted as one of among the many lawful instruments available to states to ensure the integrity of their territories and the security of their population within the exercise of their sovereignty. Instead, if active defense measures assume the character of countermeasures, they become unlawful because countermeasures cannot be implemented against anonymous perpetrators or preventively. Indeed, according to Article 49 of the Draft Articles on Responsibility of States for Internationally Wrongful Acts of 2001, the resort to countermeasures in general requires, first, the attribution to the attack to another state, and as an essential condition for the injured state to react, and second, that a violation of international law occurred, because the targeted state intervenes to compel the injuring state to comply with the previously violated international obligation. With reference to the ascertaining of international responsibility of the attacking state, it is worth underlining that a cyber attack rarely appears as internationally wrongful. Not only owing to the specific characteristics of ICT, which often bar the targeted state from attributing the attack to another state, but also because the breach of an international obligation is extremely difficult to be proven without material damages. Consequently, discipline on direct responsibility cannot be easily applied. In particular, the right of self-preservation necessarily implies that a state has been damaged by the wrongful conduct or act of another state. Thus, any cyber attack which is uncertain with respect to its author or committed by private actors, albeit politically questionable, is outside the scope of the application of the right of self-preservation, even if an international obligation has been violated. The only exception is when the injured state demonstrates that the violation by private actors is imputable to the precise instructions of a state. But having in mind the ICT attack's peculiarity, the overall and general control of the state cannot be proven in most cases. Let aside the proof of the existence of a specific and effective state control over the activities executed by private actors. Consequently, the targeted state inclined to react suffers a crisis, because whereas harboring strong suspicions on the identity of the author of the attack, it shall have no recourse to the standard mechanisms of reaction as provided for in international law. A cyber attack cannot be attributed to a state even when the injured state is able to identify the locus where from the attack originated. Indeed, under international law, the identification of the locus is not sufficient to prove the active involvement of the state from which the attack was launched. Furthermore, practice shows that mapping all the phases of a cyber attack is extremely complex and almost never leads to the identification of the effective locus of origin. Additionally, the absence of any material damage to the target, which is very frequent in cyber attacks, adds added difficulties in ascertaining the violation existence of international law. In fact, when the attack does not cause damages, or when it is not intercepted by the targeted state, its existence is highly uncertain or at all uncertain. Unfortunately, this logical thinking is not relevant in a legal perspective, because according to the draft articles on responsibility, damage does not constitute a constituent element of the international wrongful act. Eventually, even if the targeted state succeeds in attributing the attack to another state, the determination of quantum for reparation, where the attack has been entirely conducted in a network or in a system, is problematic. Difficulties related to the application of international law of direct responsibility do not exclude that a state, stricken by the negative effects of cyber attack by private actors, may invoke the indirect responsibility against the state wherein these activities originated. This kind of responsibility arises when a state is negligent in controlling those wrongful activities conducted by private actor within its territory which cause harm to other states, or when a state does not prevent the damaging effects arising from activities lawfully conducted within its territory from injuring other states. With regards to the former scenario, it concerns the responsibility for emissions, arising from a failure to enforce the due diligence according to which each state has to implement all strategies to prevent its territory to be used by private actors conducting acts of aggression or of terrorism to the detriment of other states. Conversely, the latter scenario concerns hazardous or harmful activities capable of damaging the territory of states next to the territory of the state wherein activities took place. However, the principle of indirect responsibility does not presume the existence of a specific obligation to monitor cyber threats, or rather to prevent cyber attacks against other states. And even if such an obligation were to exist, the preventive interception of cyber threats appear to be quite impossible. But difficulties encountered by a state in preventing an unforeseeable cyber attack do not exonerate it from its responsibility arising from having allowed its territory to be utilized to damage the interests of other states. In fact, each state must prevent the commission within its boundaries of whatsoever activities treating or violating the territorial or political integrity of another state. Since a state which allows hazardous activities, armed or terrorist attack from its territory against the other state is responsible, then mutatis mutandis, each state should be responsible if it does not prevent and repress any cyber attack which, originating within its territory, may violate the territorial and political integrity of other states. In this context, the implementation of preventive or selective controls on potentially hazardous cyber activities could be easily implemented by minoris generis measures, such as the obligation to provide a sufficiently rigorous internal criminal law system to prosecute and counter cybercrime, and provide cooperation to the state which has undergone a cyber attack, as Sean Harry said this morning, through a cooperation founded on intelligence and information sharing. Therefore, states not carrying out such minor measures resulted to be veritable sanctuary states, since they give criminals a free ways where to pursue their conduct. These states are responsible for neglecting to prevent their network infrastructure from being used to harm other states. Unfortunately, even if the theory of indirect responsibility of states for cyber attacks logically works, it does not resolve the real dilemma of the decision maker who needs to select in few seconds or minutes an operative choice in compliance with international law. So, here's slide number 1. To that end, I tried to outline an operative tool for the decision maker in order to determine the most appropriate response to a cyber attack, where appropriate is intended as any action not contrary to customary or treaty international law. This is the CAT matrix, a schema which takes into consideration the context of the attack, the identity of the author, and the nature of the target. Therefore, it can provide, please slide number 2, some patterns from which the decision maker will take an option of answer without the risk of committing unlawful acts. Patterns provided from the matrix are numerous and for the moment not exhaustive. The identification of the context is the first step in the evaluation by the decision maker because it quickly leads him or her through the right legal framework. For example, if the attack occurs during peacetime, the target is a critical infrastructure and the author is a state actor, in this case the decision maker will face the typical wrongful act, which leads to invoke the international responsibility of the attacked state according to international law as codified in draft articles on state responsibilities of 2001. But if the attack occurs during peacetime and the target is a critical is a private and the other is private or unknown, he knows that the attack is outside from the application, outside from the umbrella of international law. On the contrary, in wartime, for example, the scenario completely changes because the legal framework is that of international law of armed conflict. In this case, the private nature of the target does not mean that the attack does not fall within the scope of the application of international law. This is because a private target, in the sense of non-military target, can become a military objective for its specific location, purpose, or use. Obviously, sorry, the last slide. Okay. Obviously, the capabilities of the matrix to drive the decision maker toward the right choice are strictly related to its level of advancement. In particular, it should be completed with almost two other columns. The first one concerning all specific international law rules applicable to each pattern, and the second one concerning the different legal options of domestic law, among which the decision maker will select the one. And well, that is exactly what I'm going to do for the next US CyCon. So, thank you.
Cat for Anna, context author target.
Exactly,
Not
sorry.
conviction against. Any questions for Anna? I do have, oh please, here we go.
Yes.
Max Hughes from Cyber. I wanted to make sure I understood, or clarification. When you mentioned about the law or where the attacker originates, did I understand correctly that a state that allows an attack to transgress through it to the target is also liable for allowing an attack to occur from it? So if I VPN through, take over a second country's stuff, and then make the attack look like it comes from there, the lack of that nation's ability to secure its own networks is something that can be prosecuted.
Yes, I think that he is responsible if he does not provide another weight internal domestic law on cybercrimes. Because if he completely allows someone to do something in his territory, he is responsible because this is international law and the rules of international community. So.
Shift to see NATO's view of these challenges. Sim Alatalo is the Director of the International Relations Department at, of course, NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, which many of you know is our co-host for this weekend, and we thank them for that. Great partnership with ACI. Sim has brought what I would say is the most fun delegation here. If you have any chance to meet the Estonian colleagues he brought, you will enjoy it very much, trust me. But we will ask Sim to go ahead and present on his paper now, NATO's New Cyber Domain Challenge.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's truly a privilege to be here to address you. And first of all, I'd like to, of course, thank you to Rob and your team at the ACI for hosting us here. We think it's really been a very good conference to start with. We're excited to see what's going to happen next. And we're also excited to actually see the venue. So Ronald Reagan, just as an intro, tell you that he's a man in high regard in where I come from. He was seen as the culprit, so to say, for really exhausting the evil empire and bringing down the Soviet Union, which might not be seen as a positive thing in Moscow these days, but nevertheless highly appreciated that you host the conference here, and we really look forward to a long-term cooperation with ACI on cycles. Now, speaking of Ronald Reagan still, well, he's also known as a great speaker. So, speaking of NATO, one can only think what he might have said behind closed doors in a NATO meeting. Next slide, please. Because cyber, it is being discussed behind closed doors at NATO. Well, this is a unclassified event, so I won't go into details here. But you might wonder, what is NATO discussing in cyber? So this is an overview of what is being discussed on the heads of state, that is the presidents and the prime ministers level. Just to explain it in shorthand, this is very unclassified data. This is the word count from the different summit declarations and communiques since 2002, when cyber first came into NATO's agenda. And you might wonder why there is no slide for Istanbul. That is really that ever since it was first mentioned in Prague, actually cyber went away from NATO's agenda, if you believe the communiques. However, it came back strong, and you really see that in Warsaw, just this summer, NATO made some very decisive decisions in regard to cyber. So now cyber is very much on NATO's agenda, and we really need to figure out what to do with this declaration and the pledge by the heads of state and government in this regard. Next thing, please. Click once more. Actually, you can click 4 times. All right. So, well, needless to say, this is really about the growth of cyberspace. If you ask a normal citizen in our country, so what is cyber? You might get an educated answer, but you might also get an answer which hints that it's really about the internet and the connectivity of people, and more so connectivity of machines. So as was mentioned earlier today by one of the keynote speakers, human beings are becoming IP addressable. And this is really what we're seeing. When our center was established now 8 years ago, we stepped onto a scene where the growth just started. I checked the latest data as of last week. According to two sources, of the 7.5 billion people, 3.5 billion people are online. So it's using just a computer or using their smartphones. So I guess we're all in this 3.5 billion now. And it's not that nations are not doing anything about it. So you see some facts and figures which were highlighted in the original CyCon conference in Tallinn that we're hosting. Nations are undertaking legislative initiatives. Nations are also pursuing their national cybersecurity strategies. Of course, some nations, and a growing number of these, are developing offensive cyber capabilities, and there is a growing number of cyber commands. So cyber capabilities, using cyber for national gains and objectives, it's really a growing market. So many countries are increasingly active in that regard. Next one, please. And what you might call troublesome is that nations are really using cyber against each other. We have some examples from cases where you might safely say it's one nation after the other. You might also guess what might be the common denominator behind these attacks. And when I came here, just walking on the mall, I realized that I mistakenly left an important case out. That was the OPM hack, which should actually fall into the same category. But it's still safe to say that countries are using cyber to go after other countries. And we must really take this seriously. Next one, please. This is some additional figures for you. It's a survey by the Wall Street Journal, which was published about a year ago from now. So countries really are gaining the offensive capability, and even more so, there is a market where you can get this, the hacking software, for example. So it's really becoming a common thing. It's really becoming a commodity, something that's easy to gain and easy to implement. Next one, please. So, speaking of nations, yes, nations are active. Speaking of NATO, is NATO active? Now, if you take ourselves back some years, so everything that NATO does must fall under a certain roof, if I may say so. And in the case of NATO, it's the strategic concept, which was approved in the year 2010. So you can actually see that already back then, NATO was quite prudent. And again, picking up on what was said earlier today, prevent, detect, defend against, recover from cyber attacks. That was already on NATO's very broad agenda 6 years ago. Next one, please. However, the big problem with cyber is that in the same concept, NATO actually highlighted its 3 core tasks. And these are, of course, collective defense, also crisis management, and cooperative security. So if you consider these in practical terms, of course, collective defense, one for all for one, that's the ultimate thing that NATO would do in defense of its members. Crisis management, it's the peace building NATO can engage in crisis or warlike situations around the world. And cooperative security, this is really about the prevention, preemption, working with partners from across the globe. So NATO actually has cooperation agreements with about 1/3 of the global community. And when you consider those 3 core tasks, how do you really do that in cyber defense? And that is now the big question for NATO, especially in light of the Warsaw decision. So cyber is everywhere. Cyber can be hostile, hence the red color. And actually, it can really start from small things, but it can quickly grow into a situation where you really might need to consider going after Article 5 declaration. Next slide, please. So the general or central idea of my paper, of the article, was that NATO would need a joint cyber command. Well, obviously some countries in the alliance, of course, have their cyber commands, especially the US. And at the same time, NATO already has a unit which deals with cyber defense. It's called the NSERP. It's a technical center which has as its mission the topics highlighted on the screen. So you might ask, why would we need to get an additional capability for cyber defense for NATO, for the alliance as a whole? And the reason is that, next click please, and one more. The NATO command structure, that is the glue which really binds together all the military capabilities of all the 28 allies. The role of this NCS, the command structure, is to deliver the military capabilities for the 3 core tasks of the strategic concept. Click once more. And now it really becomes relevant. That is, if you want to do credible cyber defense, if you want to deliver on the heads of state and government pledge at Warsaw, you really need to take cyber defense, you need to take being a war-capable organization in the networks, so to put it very easily. You need to be able to plan operations, you need to conduct operations, and you need to do all the development, transformation, and support activities in that as well. Obviously, the question is, so how do you do that? It's a normal military thing. This is what military staffs do. How do you do that in cyber? Are the allies ready for it? And click once more. This might be like the 2 models which NATO could actually quite easily, in my view, follow. So these are basically 2 options on where to embed a cyber command without engaging in too much debates, where you might need a lot of time to get to agreement with. The 2 models are really embedding a cyber command that is a jointly run NATO command structure relevant into the existing system. Now, the one that looks more like a flower, where you have the cycle in the middle, that really is establishing an integrator command in a way. That is bringing together the different cyber defense capabilities, expertise that the existing joint force commands and the service component commands already entail. And then the other opportunity or model could be actually to start and establish a standalone cyber command. Obviously, and based on how things are done in international organizations, the eventual outcome could be something in the middle. So nations, of course, have their own views, and nations have the different capabilities. But I would say that these are the 2 easily implementable options on how to deliver on the heads of state pledge at Warsaw. Next one, please. Click once. So what I would suggest is that if you want to implement the Warsaw Pledge, you really need to act quickly. We've learned today in the different briefings that time is not on our side. That is the transatlantic community, but also not only the transatlantic community in its say treaty forum, but it also might include the countries, like-minded countries from around the world, who would need to cooperate. So it's really about how you set up a jointly run effort. You also need to consider NATO's footprint, both the political and the military. That is, you need to place the eventual units somewhere. You need to discuss between the allies what is the best location for it. You need to consider that the alliance is as strong as are the individual members, and you also need to consider that the footprint of NATO needs to span around the whole alliance. Of course, the NCS element can be started off as a coalition endeavor. By coalition, I mean a group of countries who are perhaps even more like-minded than the whole alliance at this point, and might start to get things underway quickly. It's also a question whether cyber is still a conceptual thing. So would it fall under the ACT or the Allied Command transformation, which is taking care of the future of NATO, telling where NATO should be headed, what are the threats? Or is it really a practical war-fighting effort? That is, do we put it under the operational command of NATO? And of course, the two models I mentioned earlier, and very importantly again, how does the transatlantic community cooperate with the like-minded nations around the world? This is especially relevant in the context of cyber defense. Click once more. And the bottom line really is that in cyber you cannot do the war fighting, you cannot do cyber defense alone. You really need to have a joint approach, that is an international approach to deal with this, especially if you want to deliver on what the leaders of our nations have pledged that we should do. Okay, click once more. It was mentioned that, well, we are not the international lawyers here on the panel, but just to be on the safe side, I put on a slide about the international law. It's a slide by my good colleagues at the CCDCOE, and it lists a list of options that nations could follow if they are dealing with cyber attacks. So how do you treat them and what do you do about them? Obviously, this is not, I would repeat, this is not that the Cyber Command, the jointly run institution, should be dealing with this, but it shows that it's really a area which you really need to have a comprehensive approach for. And I believe that was the last slide. Yes, it was. Thank you very much.
Questions for Sean? There.
Edward Sobies from the Army Cyber Institute. Without acknowledging who initiated it, how would your concept deal with something like the Stuxnet occurrence? How would you interpret that? How would that fit into your model?
Well, NATO always deals with stuff that its members bring to the table. So it's always a politically decided course of action, and it really depends which way you see. Is the Stuxnet, happening in the outside the country or inside NATO?
I noticed it wasn't on your list of famous attacks, so I thought I would bring it up to see how it fits. And because more and more, it sounds like you're talking only defense. Then is exploitation and preventive offense not part of this effort?
Well, I would say that you cannot rule out any sort of scenario. So, for example, in the case of if I had listed the OPM attacks, so it's really something that you need to ask if a military command is the appropriate body to deal with it. However, I would say that in order to prevent and deal with the consequences, you really need to build on the comprehensive expertise there is available, not only in your own country, but also in the other countries. And speaking of perhaps the perpetrators, so the adversaries or opponents, call them as you like, there might be, let's say, expertise in countries which might be very useful for the alliance effort. And it's better to have this knowledge integrated into a jointly run institution where it really feeds into everybody's benefit.
Wait for the microphone. Bill Wood from Army Research Lab. I also am involved with the NATO standardization committees for ISR and C2. So what I see from that is, and having a long history of NATO, you leaning towards standardization of tools and capabilities with munitions and that sort of thing. Where do you see the ability of a NATO cyber command to be able to really function with different countries having disparate infrastructure histories, cyber policies, desire to share information about their own structures with other NATO members, and big and small NATO members, keeping secrets versus NATO secrets versus open stuff, and to be able to effectively operate in a cyberspace where you have so many different interests and agendas on the defensive side, and then to conduct an operation outside the bounds of NATO with what they have or don't have?
Yeah, well, it's not going to be an easy situation, and let's say the negative effects of having to deal with a problem from a very multi-stakeholder perspective. So you have so many views are on the table. You normally get to agreement about the lowest common denominator. So. But even that, if you have even that lowest standard in place, that is already helpful in engaging in operations. And I think actually NATO's operational history has shown that it's really, I would say, a driver for all to have joint efforts to bringing everybody to the same level, and that eventually then also benefits everyone.
And to talk about the way forward, our final paper presentation will be Stefan Tayat. He lectured at the St. Cyr Military Academy, our sister military academy in France, and was perhaps very brilliant in bringing his co-authors here with him. They're in the room and are capable of answering any hard questions. Stefan does not want to.
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, of course, we are four authors, but the most possible I will try to answer myself to your question, if you have questions, of course, because I expect that at the end of my presentation we will have no more questions about this difficult topic of sovereignty. So, next slide, please. So, let's begin by stating the obvious. Sovereignty in cyberspace, sovereignty in the digital domain has become a political issue. For states, of course, with the very question of how and why states will be able to exert their control, their authority on networks, infrastructures, and even the content of digital information, and even at the international level, with the question of the mode of regulation of technical matters, of course, because this is a global network, and so you have to ensure the interoperability of the network, but also the regulation of actors' behaviors, how to regulate, what is the actors with the authority to regulate those those actors. And hence, this is a security issue. And in a sense, cybersecurity, or more precisely, cyberspace has known in recent years a process of securitization that it has been elevated at the national and international security level. But maybe we should say that the problem with dealing with this notion of security issue is that no states have the same perception of what is at stake in that realm. For some, it's the protection of the critical infrastructure, and for others, is the protection of the stability of the regime, of the social and societal cohesion, and so on. So I think that we have to deconstruct sovereignty. We have to question the very concept we naturally use when we think about cyberspace, when we think about the political reality and the social reality. And then sovereignty is not immanent. It's not an immanent characteristic of states. It is not an immanent characteristic of the international system. Sovereignty is contingent upon the prevailing political theories and practices of the time. But of course, our perception of what sovereignty actually means tends to refer to assumptions made at the beginning of the modern era. And among those assumptions is the link between the territorial unit and a supreme authority upon this territorial unit. And you see that on that view, absolute sovereignty and sovereignty in itself is not a reality, it is a concept. It is a concept, and we have to deal with that fact. And second, it is also a representation. This is an image, a picture of what we think of reality. And especially because when we think about sovereignty, we think about territorial sovereignty. But territorial sovereignty is only one mode of sovereignty. And I will refer to Stephen Krasner's 1999 book, Sovereignty, an Organized Hypocrisy, in which he delineates 4 modes of sovereignty: interdependent sovereignty, international legal sovereignty, domestic sovereignty, and Westphalian sovereignty. And the most important part of his book is to consider that sovereignty is exercised by states alongside 2 spectrums: the level of authority that the state enjoys upon other actors, and the degree of control he has on those actors and on international and domestic matters. Hence, as you see, claims of states with regards to sovereignty in the digital domain have to be assessed through an interpretative lens. Meaning, I mean by that we have to adopt, we have to see through their point of view. Of course, the point is not necessarily to take their view at face value, but we have to understand how they perceive, how states perceive the question of sovereignty in cyberspace. And so we had basically 2 research questions, 2 huge research questions, and of course we do not pretend that we succeed to answer those questions. But the first is how to explain the variation between states regarding the claims, the assertion of traditional sovereignty on cyberspace. And the second is what are the implications for collective security, and especially with regards to the problem of governance in cyberspace. Next slide, please. Next, sorry. And first, we have to understand that we choose the following model. Of course, it is a concept, so this is not the reality. Concept is not the reality, but this is a model that we find useful to understand at our time what is important regarding that question. We choose a combination. We choose an independent variable, which is the political significance given to cyberspace by states, how they perceive cyberspace how they choose to interpret two main points. First, cyberspace as a transnational space, and transnational spaces pose significant challenges and opportunities to states. That's how states perceive that point, and second, how they perceive the fact that the United States is the dominant power in cyberspace. And for some, of course, it is a threat, and for others, it is an opportunity. And we choose to delineate three behavior, if you prefer. So we used typical categories. For some states, they are bandwagoning, for example, the UK. For others, of course, they are balancing, for instance, Russia and China. And for others, still, the behavior is that of critical cooperation, for instance, the European Union member states and France. And we choose to create a matrix to understand how states perceive cyberspace through these two spectrum. But we have to discuss that. And first, I propose to discuss the notion that sovereignty in transnational space is something. This is something we already have seen in the past. For instance, in the whole globalization process, and this is the realm of what Krasner called the interdependence sovereignty. That is, the interdependent sovereignty for him is the ability for state to control the flows of ideas, of goods, of money across territorial boundaries. And interdependence sovereignty entails control more than authority. And the consequence is that in transnational space there exists an incomplete regulatory regime. Regulation is incomplete. And more often than not, as we see in the globalization process since the Second World War, that incomplete regime of regulation rests upon either cooperation between states and or the willingness of an hegemonic power to regulate that domain. And so we observe the same regarding cyberspace. Second point of discussion, and that discussion leads us to a second point, which is the discussion surrounding the very notion of the hegemony of the United States, in order to understand why, for some states, this is not an opportunity but a threat. The problem of the notion of hegemony, as demonstrated, for instance, by Lebo and Reich in their 2013 book Goodbye Hegemony, the problem with the very notion of hegemony is that it is too often seen through the prism of the lens of the capabilities of the United States to impose its will or to spread norms in order to ensure the stability of the systems. But hegemony is more about legitimacy, that is the social acceptability of that power enjoyed by the United States. That means that even if the United States is acting in the interests of the whole world or of course, of its allies, for some other states, it is not perceived as such, but as a threat. Next slide, please. So, second point, that question of the governance of the regulation. And I will begin by discussing two notions, the notion of balkanization and the notion of democratization. For some, the assertion of sovereign rights on cyberspace embodies the risk of balkanization. It has the fragmentation of a global and open network in closed, competing and national networks. This is the very notion of Balkanization, and you see the analogy with the situation in the Balkan. But first, cyberspace already is fragmented to the extent that there exist private networks, air-gap networks, and so it will be more useful to envision cyberspace at two levels. And when we speak of the risk of fragmentation, it will be better to speak of the fragmentation at the global level and not the whole cyberspace. Second, at this global level, no state is really willing to lose the gains achieved through the openness of cyberspace. And we have to understand that. Even for those states that are willing to erect virtual walls, they are not willing to disrupt the global network. And third, the problem with that notion of Balkanization is its normativeness. It is a normative term and not analytical, neither a descriptive category. For other, the actual structure of cyberspace is an experiment toward democratization. That is an attempt to rejuvenate traditional and state-based modes of governance by a range of actors deemed more efficient and more legitimate than the state. For instance, corporations, NGOs, non-profit organizations, and so it is a progress. But that vision, that representation derives from a vision which pits the private sphere against the public sphere, that considers that state and civil society, state and the market are opposite to each other. That relation between public and private spheres follow different logic, and it dependent on the context, dependent on the cultural context, on the economic context, on the historical context. Second, when we speak of the legitimacy of non-state actors, that legitimacy remains highly disputable. They are not representative. They are not representative in the sense of when we speak of democratic representation. And third, more importantly, that term also is normative, so not very useful. So, in other words, those two concepts deserve to be nuanced and understood in their proper context, and not as analytical tools allowing to guide policies regarding governance. And we propose to replace the discussion, the debate between democratization and Balkanization by one imperative: to avoid two main pitfalls. First, we have to avoid the reinforcing of the structuration of cyberspace between a core and a periphery. And second, we have to avoid the fragmentation of the global cyberspace into competing closed and national networks. Okay, I will go quickly because we are only 4 minutes. There are only 4 minutes remaining, so I will just speak of the several models implied when we speak of governance of cyberspace. Traditionally, we speak of the multi-stakeholder model and the multilateral model. That is, either we encompass every actors that have stakes in cyberspace, or only states. But in our view, we should divide multilateral into two sub-modes: exclusive multilateral governance and inclusive multilateral governance. What we see from China and other Shanghai Cooperation Organization member states is the promotion of exclusive multilateral governance. That is only states, a governance of cyberspace only by states. And in that view, we have to understand that this vision is promoted in part for fear or defiance vis-à-vis the United States. And that vision deny the legitimacy of private actors on the field of public policy. Inclusive multilateral governance, as promoted by the European Union and especially by France at the UN, for instance, is different. It is a vision which tries to reconcile openness and the inclusion of all actors and a centralized regulatory process among states. Well, next slide, please. I will conclude. Our analogy is not, of course, our analogy to understand what should be done or what could be done with regards to the governance of cyberspace is the Montego Bay Convention. Of course, this is a limited analogy because Montego Bay dealt with territorial sovereignty. But it could be useful if we understand that we could imagine that there are three concentric circles when we think about sovereignty in cyberspace. We could have what is the core circle, the core interest of the state, that is the realm of national security. We have shared interest, that is the realm of international security, and the goal will be to ensure the strategic and political stability of the international system. And in that sense, that realm will be that of interstate cooperation and the common interest sphere, in which the goal will be to perpetuate the existence of global cyberspace. So I will stop here. If you have questions, I will be really happy to answer, and I thank you for your attention.
Can we have a cadet up here, or the first one,
Okay.
and we'll go first?
Just one point, please. Don't speak too quickly because I'm French, and so I'm.
So, sir, could I ask from West Point? So, thinking about sovereignty and international law, another thing in addition to UN clause that comes to my mind is the responsibility to protect. And I'm curious, do you think that that doctrine provides helpful norms of sovereignty in relating to cyberspace?
It's a good question. Okay, I will, even if I'm not a lawyer, I will try to understand the question on a political science point of view. To me, responsibility to protect is, in general, is neither a duty nor a right. It is a responsibility. It is a responsibility for each state first, and for the international community under the Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and so on, second. Okay, look, in that case, we could imagine that it will be a useful model to understand how states could cooperate, not through international organization, but through convention. I had no time to discuss that point, but there already exists convention, bilateral or multilateral convention with regard to the regulation of cyberspace. And of course, the discussion surrounding the relation between intervention and the necessity to absolutely respect the norm of sovereignty could be a useful model to understand what is at stake here. Okay. Is there another question? Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, Courtney Gordon-Tennant, the attorney from Army Cyber Institute. So my question is, with some of the key cyber players, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc., do you think state analysis, state doctrine is becoming obsolete? And how should, and if so, how do you see the way ahead to adapt it to consider non-state actors that we don't necessarily want to recognize their legitimacy?
Okay, that's a good question. I think that the real question is, I don't deny there exists the need to adopt what currently exists in the doctrine. But to me, the real question is a matter of degree. I mean that the notion that non-state act, that the regulation of cyberspace could be an absolute regulation is not realist. And so you have to take into account that, of course, the model we propose or the way of thinking we propose is mostly directed to states, because we consider that the most important threat to international security with regard to cyberspace are states. And so I have no answer to your question, because I'm not a technician of law. I have political answers in mind, but it will be difficult for some states. It will mean that they will try, and they already are trying to control those non-state actors, to impose the state's will on them. But I don't think it's impossible. I think it is a process, always processing, you know. And so there are different ways of doing that thing. So that is my answer. Okay. Okay.
You have to go too sincere to your rest of the answer.
Okay.
Thank you to our wonderful paper panelists who could take us from the foundational level and build on that with a naval perspective, and to have a way ahead from non-lawyers on this fantastic topic. We really appreciate it. I think it's tremendous. Thank you all one more time. Appreciate it.